Hello, my name is Yusuf. Today I will be talking to you about biodiversity loss by first introducing what is biodiversity in general and different things associated with that, and then diving into the definition, causes, effects, and solutions associated with biodiversity loss. But first, we must get a general understanding of biodiversity. But what exactly is biodiversity? Well, technically, biodiversity is the biological variety and variability of life on Earth. Biodiversity is a measure of variation at the genetic, species, and ecosystem level in a certain geographical area. That geographical area can be as tiny as a small pond and as big as the entire Earth. A good way to remember what biodiversity means is to remember that bio means life, and that the root of the word diversity refers to the variety or variability of something. So, if we have a high number, if we have a large number of organisms in an ecosystem, a large number of species in an ecosystem, like the elephants, the birds, the deer, the squirrels, and the fish, the turtles, and the bees we see in this infographic. And the higher the genetic variability within those species, then the higher the amount of biodiversity we have in an ecosystem. But But what environmental factors influence biodiversity? Well, one big influencer is temperature, right? The biodiversity on an extremely cold polar ice sheet will be different than that in a hot coastal tropical region. And in real life, we actually see that the lowest biodiversity is at the poles overall, and that as we move our way from the poles towards the equator and the tropics, but total biodiversity tends to increase significantly overall. Another influencer is altitude. At the base of a mountain, you'll sometimes see lots of vegetation and wildlife. But as you move up the mountain, as you increase in altitude and elevation, as the temperature gets colder and colder and colder, the 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 amount of vegetation and wildlife that can survive at such heights decreases, and that, as a result, substantially decreases biodiversity. Precipitation is another biodiversity influencer too. In a desert, for example, you have very little rain or snow, extremely low amount of rain or snow. And as a result, only specific types of plant species can survive in the desert. What plant species? Only those plant species that have root systems specifically adapted for little rain, and those plant species that can store and effectively use water for long periods of time. Whereas in a rainforest, you have lots of rain, and as a result, you have a much wider range of plant species. And as a result, we have a much larger amount of biodiversity in the rainforest than in a desert, and that is caused by that huge difference in precipitation. Soils can have a big, big effect on biodiversity too. There are many types of soils. Some soils, like in most of Texas, are full of clay. Some soils on the coasts have lots of sand. Some soils are nutrient rich, some soils are nutrient poor, some are a mix of a lot of different materials and compounds. And that can have a big impact on biodiversity, especially microbial diversity, number one. number one, because only specific soil microorganisms can survive in specific soils. Many times that is the case. Also, soils can influence the plant species and the types of plants that can grow in that soil. Some plant species grow best in nutrient-rich soil. Some plant species are adapted to living in nutrient-poor soil and have shallow roots. And that, as a result, significantly impacts plant biodiversity, but it also impacts consumer biodiversity because there are primary consumers that eat those plants and secondary, tertiary, and quaternary consumers that eat those animals. You see, so the amount or the variety of plant diversity can move up the food chain, move up the food web, and impact the biodiversity of animals and consumers too. And at the end of the day, that means that soil can impact the entire biodiversity of the entire ecosystem, food chain, and food web. And that's where it comes in, and that's where relations or interactions with other species comes in. Because many times you have species that are more suited or best suited to their environment than others. And due to competition and a host of other interactions, those species best suited to their environment become dominant over those that are not best suited. And the losing species will have to just adapt to their environment. They'll just maybe die out, or they can migrate out of the ecosystem to find another area to live in. And that can significantly impact biodiversity. And all of this factors in to the overall climate we have in an area, and that is what determines biodiversity. That is what really determines biodiversity. But sometimes humans can have an impact on biodiversity. Humans have been known to cause a huge range of environmental issues, including pollution, right? The pollution of the water, of the air, of the land in ecosystems can cause a huge impact on biodiversity by leading to things like species decline and species extinction. Climate change and global warming can also have a significant, a ginormous impact on biodiversity. Other environmental issues, such as habitat destruction and deforestation, the permanent removal of trees from large areas of forests, can also have a ginormous impact on biodiversity. And that is sort of what we're going to focus on today, actually. The impact of humans on biodiversity. So, so here in this picture, you can see the factors that increase biodiversity and the factors that decrease biodiversity. So a physically diverse habitat, moderate environmental disturbance, small variations in environmental conditions, the middle stages of succession and evolution all increase the biodiversity we have in an ecosystem. But environmental stress, large environmental disturbance, extreme environmental conditions, severe limitations of resources, the introduction of exotic species, and habitat loss all decrease biodiversity. In the picture on the bottom right, over here, you see a crater. And this crater was probably caused by an asteroid, an asteroid or comet actually, that slammed into the ground. So, and this is probably a pretty weak ecosystem here because the animals and plants ecosystem has been destroyed, and little vegetation and wildlife can survive in this crater, and that decreases biodiversity. So So how exactly do we identify low and high biodiversity areas? Well, an example of a low biodiversity area is a monocultural wheat field. Why? Because there's only one plant species, that is, the wheat, and all the organisms, once again the wheat, look and are pretty much the same because there's little genetic variability within the species. And because of that, this can be considered a very low biodiversity area. An example of a high biodiversity area is a coral reef because there are many types of fish: clownfish, salmon, tuna, trouts, countless species of fish, many different plant and coral species, and high genetic diversity among the marine organisms. Because if you think about it, if you just look at a coral species, inside one coral species, there are many different designs and shapes in that species alone. And because of all that, this can be considered a very high biodiversity area. So over here, you can see a picture of a wheat field, while over here, you can see a picture of a diverse coral reef. So you can see the outstanding difference in biodiversity between a wheat field, a monocultural wheat field, and a coral reef by just looking at their pictures. But in real life, what areas of the world have high biodiversity and what areas of the world have low biodiversity? Well, let's look at this map of global land biodiversity. So you can easily see that some areas, like over here where I am pointing, have low biodiversity. Oh, I forgot to mention, the cooler colored areas have lower biodiversity, while the warmer colored areas have high biodiversity. So in this area here, you have biodiversity, high biodiversity. Why? Because this area is the area that is known as the Amazon rainforest. In Amazon rainforest, you have 2.5 million species of insects and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of species of amphibians, reptiles, mammals, birds, etc. Over here also, in Middle to Southern Africa and in Southeast Asia here, you also see high biodiversity. And even though it's not shown on this map, in this area off the northeastern coast of Australia is the Great Barrier Coral Reef. This is an extremely high biodiversity area because it has so much life that it is known as one of the most rich areas in terms of biodiversity on the face of the planet. Over here in the Great Barrier Coral Reef, we have lots of types of fish, lots of types of coral, marine life, um, lots of types of plants to sea life, sea plants. We have a lot of life over here. But where are the areas that have low biodiversity? Well, in northern Africa here, we see that we have very little biodiversity, and also at the poles, like we see over here near the Arctic, there's very low biodiversity, and also near Antarctica, we also have low biodiversity. And many times we have low biodiversity in ecosystems because the ecosystems are simply designed that way. It is natural. But in many cases, it is not natural, and it is caused by something serious called human-caused biodiversity, the topic of the day. But before we dive into the causes and effects and solutions associated with human-caused biodiversity loss, we need to understand what is biodiversity loss in the first place. Well, biodiversity loss is the decline in the number, genetic variability, and variety of species in the biological communities in a given area. This loss in the variety of life can lead to a breakdown in the functioning of the ecosystem where a decline has happened. Sadly, biodiversity has emerged as one of the major environmental issues of the 21st century, resulting in ecosystem collapse, extinction of species, contribution to the climate crisis, and sadly also the increased spread of infectious diseases. So over here on this slide, you can see the many causes of biodiversity loss. So the causes of biodiversity loss include swamp drying, right? The drying of swamps and ponds. Deforestation, the permanent removal of trees from large areas of forest. Steppes plowing, so the plowing of steppes, which are basically another name for grasslands that are in Asia. Overgrazing can also cause biodiversity loss. Urban construction, which can lead to habitat destruction, which can therefore lead to biodiversity loss. Pollution, poaching, dams construction, hunting, overfishing, animal skins, tropical fish trade, climate change, death from vehicles, wild animals trade, and bird trade are also serious causes of biodiversity loss. So all of these causes show that biodiversity is not just an easy issue to solve. It is a multifaceted environmental issue that poses serious threats to our planet today. So over here, you can see an infographic of all the different causes of biodiversity loss. Now, what is the effect of this? What is the effect of a reduction in biodiversity loss because of all of these mostly human activities? Well, the effects of biodiversity loss include ecosystem collapse, so the collapse of entire ecosystems. And if that ecosystem did not collapse, biodiversity loss can lead to reduced ecosystem complexity as well as higher extinction rates. So species can just go extinct because of biodiversity loss. Other effects include climate change. Biodiversity loss can contribute to global warming too. Biodiversity loss can also cause ozone pollution, acid deposition on forests, so basically acid rain, and that can kill off plants and trees and damage infrastructure. Biodiversity loss can also cause nutrient pollution, water pollution, air pollution, reduced food production, bee colony losses. So as a result, bee colonies can struggle to survive and really it can impact even the production of honey. And biodiversity loss can also lead to impacts on agriculture, including less crop diversity, less soil diversity, less livestock diversity, as well as a lower number of tree species. So over here, you can see different effects of biodiversity loss. You can see the different effects of biodiversity loss on many organisms, including soil biodiversity, fish, animal species, mushrooms, coral, insects, trees. It can impact many species. But we can't fully grasp and get a hold of the impacts of biodiversity loss without looking at biodiversity loss statistics. So as a result of biodiversity loss and other issues, we have sadly lost 76 of freshwater wildlife, like the freshwater fish you see over here, probably migrating. We have lost 39% of terrestrial wildlife since 1970, 39% of marine wildlife since 1970, 83% of Latin American biodiversity, 56% of populations in most of the tropics, and 52% of the world's biodiversity. All of this because of biodiversity loss and species extinction. And it gets worse. Sadly, due to biodiversity loss and species decline, 31,000 species are threatened with extinction, including 41% of amphibians, 4 out of 10. Can you imagine that? 34% of conifers, 33% of coral reefs, 30% of sharks and batoids, 27% of crustaceans, 25%, a quarter of mammals, as well as 14% of birds. So over here in this photo, you can see the golden toad. The golden toad is a species that's now sadly extinct, and many people blame its extinction on global warming. And this is an example of an animal species who sadly has been the victim of biodiversity loss. But thankfully, there are solutions to biodiversity loss. Biodiversity loss solutions include implementing government restrictions and policies, education, protection of habitats and species, stopping deforestation. So in this photo over here on the left, see a land that has been deforested or where the trees have been killed off. But on the right, as a result of stopping deforestation and applying volunteer efforts in government restrictions and policies, perhaps, it has been repopulated with trees again. Preventing overhunting and overfishing can also be a solution to biodiversity loss. So is preventing species so invasive species, stopping pollution, stopping overexploitation. Other biodiversity loss solutions include saving energy, stopping overconsumption, as well as just simply convincing others that biodiversity is a real issue with real-world implications. On the right here, you see an infographic by the WWF titled Nature Positive by 2030 and shows here the problems, the goals, and the solutions associated with biodiversity loss and also the benefits of biodiversity loss solutions. And just actually in the next slide, we'll look at information from this infographic relating to the benefits of biodiversity loss solutions. So finally, what are the benefits of implementing these biodiversity loss solutions? Well, there are many benefits. These include enormous human benefits, in fact, including water for 9 billion people, food for 9 billion people, which is very important considering the number of people who do not have access to clean water and who are hungry in the world today. Of course, diversity of life will be significantly improved by these policies, as well as a stable climate, which is important in this day and age if you want to combat the climate crisis and fight the heat waves, floods, droughts, and other natural disasters that come with it. Biodiversity loss solutions also improve human health and well-being. Thank you for listening to this presentation with me.